Hello, and welcome to Bites, a podcast produced by the Rover Tobacco Control Library at UC Davis. I'm Joseph Martin, and in this episode, we're going to be talking with Chris Bostic, who is the Deputy Director for Policy with the tobacco control advocacy group Action on Smoking and Health. Chris gave a couple of presentations at the 2018 Tobacco-Free California Projects meeting held in Long Beach in November, including a talk on phasing out the sale of cigarettes, starting a movement, which he gave during a general session on the first day. That presentation, as well as other discussions of an endgame for tobacco in California, generated a lot of enthusiasm at the conference, and we thought it'd be interesting to follow up by interviewing Chris. So we gave him a call at his office in Washington, D.C. And now let's welcome him to our program. Thank you for joining us, Chris Bostic.
My pleasure, Joseph. Thank you for having me.
First of all, I want to say it was great hearing your presentation at the conference, and I think a lot of people were excited about the possibility of phasing out the sale of cigarettes. Is this an idea whose time has come? What kinds of things are you seeing to indicate that this is now a realistic goal?
You know, I've been pleasantly surprised at the positive reaction from public health colleagues to this concept. I started my tobacco control career way back in 2001, and one of the first things I was told by my bosses was, don't ever talk about sales. We can't be seen as prohibitionists. But since then, we've seen some dramatic changes in tobacco control around the world. There was the completion of a global tobacco treaty, a smoke-free air movement that has moved from just California to protecting billions of people, a global recognition that selling tobacco amounts to a human rights violation, and then, of course, we've had advances in our understanding of the health impact of tobacco products, in particular the manipulation of the chemistry of cigarettes by the tobacco industry to make them by far the most addictive consumer product in history. That last part on the addiction was key to my own personal journey toward endorsing a sales ban. The tobacco industry has intentionally made it as difficult as possible for people to quit. And the vast majority of smokers want to quit, have tried to quit, wish they had never started, and are desperate to stop their children from starting smoking. I should point out that some jurisdictions may not be ready for this, or ready to ban the sales of tobacco products. California has been brilliant in driving down its prevalence via what I'd call traditional tobacco control policies. Things like taxes, smoke-free air, counter-media campaigns, and access to cessation products. But for those not politically ready for true endgame policies, I say keep going. Do the traditional tobacco control. We know what works to drive down prevalence, and then when you're ready, we'll be happy to talk about the checkmate move, which is banning the sales. And this campaign goes well beyond California and the United States. For the past few years, I've spoken with hundreds of colleagues around the world who are eager to do this at home. There are a number of countries that are in a California-like position, having driven down their prevalence, like Australia, New Zealand, and Uruguay. And then there are others who are still so early in the stages of the tobacco epidemic, especially sub-Saharan Africa, that they have a low prevalence now and can avoid generations of catastrophic damage if they act forcefully.
So how do we move forward from here? What kinds of policies and goals should we be focused on right now?
Well, I envision this movement paralleling to some degree the smoke-free air movement. There's little chance of a federal policy ending tobacco sales. The industry is too powerful, and there are those in Congress who openly and proudly defend tobacco industry interests. This will start small and build, with cities and counties and then states, and then I have no doubt other countries. The informal national group that I am working with is not being prescriptive on what policy governments ought to implement so long as the goal is zero tobacco sales. There are several options, including gradually reducing licenses to zero, setting a future date when sales will be banned, and then what's known as the tobacco-free generation concept, in which the minimum age of purchase is raised 1 year every year so that anyone born after a certain date can never purchase tobacco. There have been some very creative ideas put forward. One country was considered taxing individual cash registers that sell tobacco and then steadily raising that tax until it would no longer make any economic sense for retail to sell it. The main obstacle that we must overcome on this is the notion that it's illegal or somehow impossible. We need to remember that the original Surgeon General report in 1964 was released on a weekend to avoid crashing the stock market. The Surgeon General worried about this because he assumed that once it was clear that tobacco kills when used as intended, society would ban its sale, which of course we would have done had there not been this entrenched multi-billion-dollar industry behind it. It's also worth noting that until 2009, tobacco products were the only consumer products not under the authority of the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. Even when they gave them the authority, Congress had to explicitly forbid the FDA from banning sales. They did this because they knew if the FDA applied the same rubric on health to tobacco products that they apply to everything else, they would have no choice but to ban their sale. By the way, that same 2009 law explicitly reserved the rights for states to ban tobacco sales.
Is there a danger of overreaching in any of this? How should we respond to people who would say that banning tobacco sales is an extremist position?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Society should be hyper-cautious when it considers banning anything. It would be unethical to do so for religious or moral reasons, which was the case earlier last century when a number of states did ban tobacco sales. I've definitely had my share of negative comments about the slippery slope. They say, well, we didn't have to ban alcohol, then fast food, then soft drinks, et cetera, et cetera. But I think tobacco products are unique. They are highly addictive and kill when used as intended. As Professor Robert Proctor wrote in his book, The Golden Holocaust, cigarettes are the most deadly artifact in the history of civilization. I think it's quite easy to separate tobacco from other health risks and regulate each of them according to its nature and its harm. There are two other aspects that I think are important I'd like to get out there. First, we are talking about ending the sale of tobacco products, not the possession or use. The whole prohibition didn't work argument is fairly meaningless here. No cop is ever going to pull you over and search your car on the suspicion that you have tobacco in the glove compartment, say. The other thing to keep in mind, and it's a subtle but important issue, is that we're addressing the behavior of the tobacco industry, not its customers. So if the definition of liberty is that you should be able to do whatever you want, provided it does not harm anyone else, the tobacco industry actions don't meet that standard. We've had scores of global organizations, including some human rights groups, that concluded that the marketing and selling of tobacco is a violation of human rights norms. So from the human rights perspective, governments actually have a legal duty to ban the sale.
Your presentation focused mainly on cigarettes, but how do other tobacco products like e-cigarettes fit into this?
That's another excellent question that comes up quite a lot. In the United States, virtually all deaths from tobacco use come from cigarette smoking. There are definitely health risks associated with the use of other tobacco products, but combustible tobacco is the driver of the tobacco epidemic here in this country. I would personally be okay if a jurisdiction, as a first step, was to ban the sale of combustible tobacco. But I'd also support any jurisdiction that wanted to go further and target all tobacco products, including e-cigarettes. For one thing, it is becoming clearer and clearer that e-cigs are far from safe. It will be years before we know the long-term effects, but we should take a precautionary approach. And second, the tobacco industry has a long history of tweaking the engineering of their products to get around legislation. For example, when candy-flavored cigarettes were banned several years ago, the industry started marketing candy-flavored little cigars, which they made as small and affordable as possible without meeting the definition of cigarettes. And of course, those are now very popular among youth. And finally, if we're concerned about death and disease, as of course we should be, we must remember that addiction is a disease and a harm in and of itself. It's utterly shameful, and many would argue that it's actually criminal manslaughter to market a product that is both addictive and deadly. But it's also pretty immoral to market a product that is highly addictive, even if it doesn't cause death.
Does the movement to legalize marijuana pose any special challenges? Are people confused about why we're liberalizing one product and talking about banning the sale of another?
It does, and that comes up quite a lot. I think it's both a challenge and an opportunity, though. On the one hand, you're right. Going after tobacco seems to swim against the current when it comes to cannabis. But on the other hand, society is reevaluating its regulatory approach to marijuana. And this can be seen as an attempt to reconcile policy with science and facts, right? So if we're doing that, let's consider reevaluating our approach to tobacco as well. Current regulation certainly doesn't fit the incredible harm it causes. And in terms of potential confusion, we are working with the Newhouse School at Syracuse University to conduct some research on public attitudes. And the results so far indicate that people don't have any trouble differentiating between marijuana and tobacco when it comes to regulation. From a policy perspective, the various state approaches to cannabis may have some lessons for us. For example, my home city of Washington, D.C. is doing basically what we're pushing for tobacco. It's legal to possess and use cannabis, but there are no commercial sales. Of course, some people are getting around that by being clever. For example, there have been several NGOs started up that take donations and then give marijuana as a back-end gift, and that's just another way of selling it that doesn't sound like commercial sales. I do also worry about those states that have very few restrictions on marijuana marketing and sales. We don't know a lot about the long-term impact of marijuana use because it's been mostly illegal to research it until recently. If a problem surfaces down the road and those states want to have stricter regulation, they're going to find themselves facing a multi-billion-dollar industry with a clear, opposing interest.
At the conference, you talked about how there is more public support for a gradual ban than an immediate ban on the sale of cigarettes. What kind of time frame does that imply? Is it realistic for us to talk about ending the tobacco epidemic in California by 2035?
Yeah, it's a good question. From an advocacy standpoint, it's always important to set goals, especially if it's going to be a public communications campaign. But we don't actually think the tobacco epidemic will still be going in 2034 and then suddenly halt in 2035. The time frame is going to vary by jurisdiction and, of course, by when they take action. There will be early adopters and late adopters. For me, any horizon beyond 10 years for a given city or county is much too long. It doesn't serve a public health purpose to drag it out that far. But having a window between when a law is passed and when it is implemented or is gradually phased in, that serves several purposes. Most importantly, it gives tobacco users time to quit. On that note, I should also point out that any government that wants to end tobacco sales has a moral obligation to ensure cessation services for anyone who wants them. We can't abandon the existing smokers. Fortunately, California already has a very robust cessation program.
Well, this is all great stuff, and I want to thank you for speaking with us, Chris Bostic.
Happy to participate, Joseph. Thank you.
And thank you all for listening. The Bites podcast is a production of the Rover Tobacco Control Library, a funded project of the California Tobacco Control Program. We're working on a series of episodes on all the funded projects of the CTCP, and we're also looking forward to covering new research and emerging issues in tobacco control. If you've got an idea for a podcast, or if you have thoughts or suggestions you'd like to share, please send me an email at joemartin@ucdavis.edu. That's all lowercase JOMARTIN @ucdavis.edu. I'm Joseph Martin, and this has been Bites.